So without further ado, let's get cracking. I'm going to introduce and welcome Anit Chandarana to today's webinar.
Hi, Nina. Thank you for the brilliant introduction. If you could tell, I'm blushing, but
I can, just about. It's an absolute joy and a pleasure to welcome you to the webinar, Anit. Our first conversation is quite a few months ago now, and I feel like we've been getting to know each other over that time. And each and every conversation that we have had lifts my spirits, inspires me and educates me. So there's no pressure there. I've not set the bar that high. But I'm going to hand over to you to share your experiences, your insights, your thoughts in relation to what strong allyship means to you.
Thanks, Nina. Maybe today's going to be the day I reset the bar back down at the low level so that I can climb it up again. But you can tell me that at the end. And so thinking about allyship, and I'm not going to come at this from a theoretical perspective or a textbook perspective. I'm going to come at it from my personal experiences of allyship, which means that this is my story, and it means this is what was true for me, but may not be true for others and for everyone else. So whilst there will be elements of learning to take from, what I'm not giving anyone is the blueprint for allyship, because I'm not sure such a thing exists. And hopefully when we get towards the end of today's webinar, we'll understand better why I think that. I think the first thing to say is I can, with my hand on my heart, say without allyship, I probably wouldn't be where I am today. And I say that with a slightly heavy heart, because we still have the need for that. But mostly I say that with joy in my heart, because it means that people did think it was important enough to play that role. And if they did for me, I'm really confident that there'll be people out there doing similar for others. And of course, what I'm hoping is there's people on this call who will see their role as an ally, as well as people who are seeking allies. And I think the other thing to kind of bring out in that big way is, as well as my needing allyship from others, I can also be an ally to others people in the areas that perhaps are not the one that I experience in my day-to-day life. And so it's not an exclusive club. And we mustn't feel like, because some of us who are from those minority groups, that we don't have a role to play in allyship for others. So to start with, I thought maybe a couple of examples of where I've really seen allyship at work in my lifetime, and I'm going to stretch a bit beyond my working life, because allyship can be exhibited in any number of walks of life. And as ever, Nina, you got me thinking a bit harder about this than I had been previously when you and I spoke last. And I think my first kind of living memory of allyship comes from kind of the neighbourhood I lived in when we were growing up. So I grew up in a part of southeast London that was not particularly culturally diverse. We were the only family of colour in our area. I almost sound like I should be in a comedy programme or something at that stage. What I remember is we moved from a place called Bromley to a place called Mottingham in the early 80s. And that part of London was it actually had some pretty decent problems around race relations and so on. And I remember one time a really difficult situation where the house we lived on was on a main road, and somebody threw a brick through our front door, and it was and around it was a message which was clearly a difficult message for us to read, about how we weren't welcome in that area. And what I remember is the way our close neighbours really rallied around us, really despite that really unwelcoming moment, really made us feel welcome. And perhaps were it not for that, we'd have felt like we'd have had to have moved, which would have meant that those who were filled with hate would have won.
Yes.
And for me, that really describes the power of allyship, because it can be a lonely place to be in that world of difference, to be the person that's different there. And then beyond that, it provides determination and it provides rationalization for why we would feel determined not to be beaten by that situation. And as I kind of take that forward into my school life, I really, and this next instance didn't come from a moment of hate at all. It came from a moment of somebody genuinely not understanding that there is difference. And some of you might know that last week was a really important cultural event for people of the Hindu religion. It was Diwali last week. And thinking about today reminded me of something that happened at school. So Diwali, for those of you who don't know about it, is the most significant event in the Hindu calendar. It is celebrated by Hindus in much the same way as Christmas is celebrated by Christians. Indeed, it's celebrated by as much as a cultural festival as much as a religious festival. And when I was growing up in school, my parents were really keen to keep that tradition going in our family. So every year when that came around, we would not go to school, all done properly with school permission. And one of my actually quite close friends said, "It's not very fair, is it? This is a school day. You get Christmas off as well. Why would you get today off?" Genuine curiosity. And my teacher overheard this, and she said, "Well, that's all right then. We'll cancel Christmas holiday, shall we?"
Right.
And and she did it in a way that caught the mood of the moment. It wasn't a difficult moment, and she did it in a way that was quite humorous, but still got her point across. And in that moment, that individual went, "Oh yeah, that would be stupid, wouldn't it? Oh, okay, off you go."
Yeah.
And bred kind of understanding in a really, really nice way. So maybe a couple of examples of outside work, which I picked deliberately because it's quite tempting when we are having these conversations to think about allyship within the defined world of work. And in doing that, we perhaps don't think of the importance of that it goes beyond the world of work, and we don't do it from the perspective of this is about fairness and natural justice as opposed to making just people feel comfortable at work. Of course, we want to do that, but it's that bigger aim. So if I then kind of collectively think about some examples at work, what have typified some of those examples? And actually, some of the people who've been allies got in touch with me again after our podcast to reminisce and so on. And I think there's different things I pick out from that. First of all, when I think about the people that have been allies, I can think about people who've been in senior positions. I can think of people who've been peers that I work close with, and I can think of people who were potentially team members of mine. And I say that because it's quite tempting to think of allies as something that senior people do. But actually, I'll welcome allyship from anyone that's prepared to give it to me. And what did those conversations feel like? And this is about personal experiences rather than kind of open discussions that people might have in a room. So some of those discussions have been about personal encouragement. Actually, don't let this be a barrier to your success. Don't let people win, and giving me encouragement to take the next challenge, not to be beaten by the next challenge. Other times, people have stepped in to defend me, when they've seen bad behaviours, when they've seen people doing the wrong thing, or indeed when they've seen kind of unintended outcomes from conversations. And then finally, they've challenged me. They've challenged me on what I think about my role in the organisation. So one particular example of allyship is when somebody said to me, after I'd become relatively senior in the organisation I was, is, actually, do you think you do enough as a role model of somebody of colour to support others? And showing your success as something that others can aspire to. And again, perhaps a slightly different take on what people might imagine allyship is. So I hope that's kind of illustrated some real examples and some tangible acts of allyship that I have personally experienced and can help others think about that.
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. I think I have a couple of questions. Is that all right?
Yeah.
That feeling of having a brick put through the front door with a message on it. How did your parents respond to that? How did you as a family respond to that before you realised that your close neighbours were going to be there to support? How did that feel in the moment when that happened?
Yeah, so I should give a bit more context, because in order to answer that question, we need to understand that. So this happened within 2 days of us moving into our new house, where actually we hadn't, up until that point, really even met any of our neighbours. We'd kind of nodded heads in that quite reserved way that people do when you first moved in. We'd not got to the stage of kind of knocking on a door and introducing ourselves or any of that. I guess there were quite surprising aspects from my parents was one of pragmatism. Now, you could see that as something quite positive, but that pragmatism came from this is what you come to expect, which was a really sad aspect. But the other thing that was brilliant was these neighbours that we'd not even met yet were there within minutes.
Okay.
Sorry, this. And what that then really created was actually, we don't need to be pragmatic about this, because we don't have to accept it. They were in a position of, well, we'll just have to get a stronger front door, or we can't have a front door with glass in it now. We're going to have a front door with a little bit of glass. And the speed with which the unacceptability of that was acknowledged by neighbours who, offered to guard the front door until it was mended and all that kind of stuff, was amazing.
Right. It's a brilliant example of what people can do when the opportunity strikes, I guess, because there will be, and I'm sure we can all think of situations where people will just kind of turn away and pretend that didn't happen, or would actually think about their own situation, like, oh my word, we're living next to this family and all of this is going to keep happening now they've moved in, kind of comment. But you got the opposite of that, which has made a really significant difference, didn't it?
No, correct. And I think the other aspect of that, and you can really apply this to allyship in general, which is the difference between wanting to understand why what was happening to us and just at the same time recognizing it wasn't acceptable, versus kind of pretending to just to imagine that they could understand for themselves without that conversation what it felt like to be in that situation. And some of the things that allyship I think is really pivotal on is We hear kind of terms which aren't put in the nicest ways, but if you've not stood in the shoes of somebody going through that, it's almost impossible to understand what it can feel like. And so much of allyship comes from that understanding of what lived experience can really be like before you can kind of begin to encourage or challenge people is really important. So when allyship is done well, it comes with that strong sense of, I want to understand your situation so I can help you better, as opposed to just diving into sorting the problem out, because actually just sorting the problem out often can work against the allyship perspective.
Yeah. That understanding is so important, isn't it? But I also think it's where one of the blockages appears, because in order to understand, then we have to ask questions. And sometimes it can feel that those questions might be intrusive or too personal, or, kind of wanting to, in order to understand, we need to have a conversation, and that conversation might be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But we've got to do it anyway. We've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. But I think, personally, that's one of the blockages where we need to understand better, but there's a kind of, we're holding back from asking the questions because they might not be the right questions.
I think that's really right. And I think if I think of it from the receiving end, trying to figure out how we can create an environment where that allyship is expected as opposed to unexpected is a really important thing to think about, because and I've seen something in the chat which refers to this. If I think back to that situation with the neighbours, the reason it was a surprise was because it wasn't the reaction we expected from our neighbours. The first time round, the thing that gave us strength was that the second time round, if it were to happen again, we knew that we would expect that reaction. And can you imagine if you are, and you probably can, if you're in an organisation where where life could be unfair at times, and believing that organisation or individuals in that organisation aren't going to be there to support through that difficult times. And the truth is, Nina, is that a lot of our industry, that is exactly how people in minority groups feel. Which is why allyship is really important. And the other aspect of it, the reason it's important, is because it begins to show that this isn't just a struggle for people of minority groups, that actually people from wider environments understand the unjustness and the unfairness of it, and then they're not going to be prepared to stand there and see that happen.
It's interesting. There's another question in the chat from Adam Stevens around leadership, and how does the leadership of, I guess, an industry as well as an organisation build that kind of culture, and I think that's something that we will come on to and discuss in more detail after the break, and in terms of just debating what are the key components of creating a culture where strong allyship does exist, and not only does it exist, but it thrives because we know it's the right thing to do, and therefore it's the way we do things around here.
Exactly, and that kind of brings me on to the second part of what I was going to cover, which is what do I think? What, in my experience, what has made good allies? As I say, this is my views, not the textbook answer, and therefore reflects the opinion of one person rather than somebody who's not particularly academic either. So, some words that I'll walk through. You can't be an ally in secret. You have to be vocal. You've got to be proud, and you've got to voice that allyship, because the point of allyship is it's not just about individual private conversations you have, either just with yourself or with others. Without that vocalization of it, it's not going to change. You've got to be prepared to challenge. You can't, if you see something that isn't on, so you can't profess to be an ally if you are not prepared to actually step in and say and challenge people who don't deliver against the right values. Of course, I want everyone to be supportive of this, but if you want to call yourself an ally, which is beyond just being supportive, you've got to be prepared to get in there and challenge the status quo. There's also an element then of, if it's about individual allyship, so if you're supporting an individual, it has to be that individual conversation, and it goes back to that understanding of the individual circumstances, and it can't be, there isn't a generic answer to allyship. There is overall allyship, but if it's an individual thing, then it's about understanding. And I've seen some in the stream, some phrases around empathy and really important characteristics. And linked to that, be prepared to hear really what it feels like to be in the shoes in that world. Some of you might have seen a blog that I did when George Floyd's murder occurred, because that really was a moment for me to step back and think about how was my life different to those of my peers around me. And some of you might know a chap called Tim Shoveler, who's at Rail now, and he won't mind me saying this, but he said that whilst he kind of anticipated that the things I'd said happened to people, it wasn't until I had said it happened to me, and then he related it to somebody he knew, that it really came home to him about some of the advantages that he had that just were not real in the life of somebody else in the world. So really understanding that. And one of the things we've been working quite a lot on is reciprocal mentorship, and you that might be something we cover later on. And part of my reciprocal mentorship was I've done 2 rounds of that. One with somebody who had mental health and well-being issues and was prepared to talk to me about that, and somebody else who was profoundly deaf and what that meant in their world of work. And I can tell you, I absolutely did not understand their world. I might have thought I did until I had those conversations. And how I thought I could help them as an ally was entirely different after I'd talked to them compared to before I'd talked to them. Really be prepared to role model your allyship, and it's such a powerful instinct to see, we particularly for leaders, to be able to role model what allyship really means. Their followers will follow them. That's what leadership is about. And so you've got to role model it. And as much as big things will really turn the needle, don't underestimate the power of small things, small items. A word of encouragement here, a recognition of something that's going on in that individual's world, like when it was Diwali last week, just people without prompting saying to me Happy Diwali made it feel like a more inclusive world that we lived in. So remembering those small things matter. Of course I want people to make huge strides and do big things as well, but don't feel like the small things aren't worth doing.
No, absolutely agree with that. And actually lots of small things add up to pretty big things in the end anyway. But it's those small things that are more, they're easier to do. It doesn't need to be a project that we have to, kind of sit down and plan. How are we going to do this? It can just be something as simple as acknowledging a religious festival, for example, or asking about it. There was some fabulous stuff on social media during Diwali this year that I haven't been aware of before. I've kind of been aware of bits of it, and, various different organisations and individuals will post I'll put a LinkedIn post, for example, with an image that says Happy Diwali, and there's the image of the candle, and you kind of, that's great. But actually this year, there just seemed to be a lot more conversation going on around what it actually means,
you're
what
right.
it's about.
You're right. One of the things that we when I switched the TV on when I got back from my mum's, actually, we were out for Diwali. The Sky football match was on, and it was West Ham who was playing at home, and West Ham's ground is in East London, which has actually got quite a large multicultural community. And one of the things the Sky camera did was then pan to the skyline, and fireworks is a big thing for Diwali.
Yeah.
And it was this magical display of fireworks, and Sky used that as a way of acknowledging that it was Diwali, which is a brilliant example of just making multiculturalism a normal facet of life and celebrating it.
Yeah.
And really, I think if you think about the individual things I've said there, it's really about if you want to be an ally, you've got it in your hands to do that. It is about taking action. It can be small things, it can be big things. You don't need to be a senior individual. There's sometimes this aspiration of only people who in senior roles can do that. It is anyone and everyone can take that role, and in whatever shape you do that, big or small, be clear that it matters and it makes a difference, and it gives people hope that it will. But it takes courage.
Yes. Yeah. I think you made a really good point earlier. You made lots of really good points, but the one I'm referring to is around the fact that you don't need to be a senior person to do this. Anybody can be an ally. And also, if you're from a minority group yourself, that does not preclude you from being an ally
Indeed.
to someone in a different minority group. We've had a question in the chat earlier from Derek Hull about how comfortable are you with that? Is this something that comes naturally, Anit, or do you think about, right, okay, I want to go and find out more about this person, or what would be an example of that?
Good question. Well, look, I grew up in an era where the mantra was you've got to assimilate to be successful. And I carried that with me for a long time, that, what I needed to do was be like my white counterparts if I was going to succeed. And I hear similar from women where they say, if you want to be successful, before you had to be like men.
Yeah.
And so actually the term allyship and my role as an ally isn't something that I thought about until relatively recently. I'd say within the last 3 to 5 years of my kind of working life. I'd always, I had recognised the role of allies in supporting me before, but I hadn't thought hard enough, more for me, rather embarrassingly, about my role as an ally to other groups of people. And if you then think about it logically, well, that just doesn't make much sense, because actually, whilst I might not appreciate the exact issues that those individuals go through, I can understand a bit more what it means about being in a minority group. So potentially, people from minority groups start this journey at a bit of an advantage. I'd go further than just saying I was embarrassed about it. Actually, I was being really selfish about it, because I was only thinking about myself in the terms of allyship, and I wasn't thinking about what I might do for others in that space as well. So it was a moment of embarrassment to realise that I wasn't doing my part to be an ally for others.
It's interesting. And the other thing that I keep coming back to in my head, which is all around, how do we learn and how do we understand? The example that you shared with us at the beginning of this conversation around the situation at school with Diwali and Christmas, in terms of why did you get an extra day off? What occurs to me there is that there's a phrase, isn't there, out of the mouths of babes. When we are children, we don't have any of those restrictions on what we're going to say. And I'm sure any of us with children will have all been in an embarrassing situation or two
correct.
over the years where, you know, your child says something that would not necessarily be what we would call socially correct. So that kind of almost where my head's going to is that if we could all put ourselves back into childhood mode in terms of being, instead of having these limits on us that say, well, that's not appropriate, that might be offensive. And I remember having a conversation with Sharon Amesu, who was one of our previous guests on the webinar, and saying to Sharon, you know, I'm concerned that if I ask a question that it might be offensive, it might be the wrong question. And her response to me was, Nina, as long as you are asking with the right intent,
absolutely,
then that is fine.
Well, for me, that's all about this understanding point, right? You know, if you think about that kind of those embarrassing situations when your kids have asked those difficult questions, and I remember a really difficult one when my kids were young, where I think we were in a restaurant or some other social environment, and clearly the person who was at the next table or near us hadn't used their deodorant that morning. And you know, he said to me, Dad, why does this man smell behind me, in a loud enough voice where the guy could clearly have heard what he said. You know, and so but in the way that my teacher did, which was just to very quickly and easily figure out how they could think of a parallel that brought that understanding to that individual, was very powerful. And one of the things allies can absolutely do is procure honest conversations.
Yeah.
You know, what is it? Yeah. And it's possible that that people in the workplace today absolutely harbour some of those things, some of those issues. And if we don't have honest conversations, we can't get through those. So allies, I think, have a powerful role in helping breed those honest conversations in an environment of understanding and creating the right outcomes from those conversations, as opposed to letting those issues fester. You know, sometimes it can be quite obvious when there are smouldering issues, and you have to bring those to a head.
Absolutely. I think you definitely get my vote for let's have more honest conversations. I think let's be more curious and let's take action and do, rather than just say I'm an ally. So what actually is what are the actions? And we're going to come on to that obviously after the break, in terms of more practical ideas for people to take back to not just the workplace actually, but their whole life, in terms of how they can help in this area. Anit, thank you so much. You know from previous experience that I could talk to you for hours. I find your willingness to have these open and honest conversations and express your own vulnerability is really unusual, especially in the type of environment, the working environment that we're in. And I want to thank you for that again. You did it beautifully in the podcast that we did together, and you do it in every conversation we have. But thank you for sharing what you shared with us